We've currently got over 100 people on the call this evening, which is amazing. We want as many people to hear about these calls as possible, obviously. So if you enjoy the calls, then please do tweet with the hashtag NEF briefing and say something nice about us to help us spread the word. For those of you who tried to zoom into the last call and found out that you couldn't because we were at full capacity, apologies about that. We experienced an issue with Zoom last week, which we've definitely fixed this week. So that's really good. You can watch a recording of last week's briefing, which was on fixing the social safety net on the events page of our website. And I think we're posting a link to that in the chat now. You can also register for next week's briefing right now. It's going to be a very good one. It will be on childcare under lockdown. And we're going to hear from author and trustee of Rethinking Economics, Christine Berry, as well as NEF's own head of co-production, Lucy Stevens. So we're posting the link for that in the chat now. So please do take the time to sign up. Okay, great. So I think it's fair to say that coronavirus has exposed deep cracks in our housing system. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the experience of renters and the homeless community. As we all know, millions of people are likely to lose their jobs or take home a reduced income because of the crisis. This is already forcing many renters into making impossible choices between losing their income and so not making rent and going out to work when they should be staying at home. On top of this, many local authorities have taken emergency measures to house rough sleepers. The government estimates that more than 13,500 households have been placed in emergency accommodation. This is a positive step, but is it enough? And what happens to the homeless community when the crisis is over? More generally, what has the experience of renters and the homeless community been so far during the crisis? And how should we be responding to all of this at the levels of national and local government, as well as on-the-ground organising? So to talk us through all of this tonight, we have four, hopefully, incredible speakers. So first of all, we'll hear from Hanna Wheatley, who is Senior Researcher at NEF. Hanna will talk about why renters and homeless people are particularly vulnerable during this crisis, the government's current response, and some potential policy solutions. Then we were going to hear from Charmina August, but unfortunately Charmina's had to pull out. So instead we're going to hear from Diarmaid Ward, who's a councillor, an executive member for housing and development at Islington Council. And he's very kindly offered to step in at the last minute, so thank you, Diarmaid. So he's going to talk about what progressive local authorities have been doing on the front line of this crisis, as well as some of the obstacles that they face. And then we'll hear from Anny Cullum, who is national organiser with Acorn Tenants Union. Anny will talk about the demands the tenants movement have been making and what the plan is to win them. Finally, we'll hear from John Glackin, who is the founder of Streets Kitchen, a grassroots group working with the homeless community. John will talk about what the experience of the homeless community has been so far during the crisis and what we could all be doing to support them. As with last week, the speakers will talk one after the other for 5 minutes. Whilst they're talking, please try and type any questions that you have in the chat box, and we're going to do our best to put them to the speakers. We're going to try and wrap up the call by 8 p.m. this evening, so with four amazing speakers, we are quite tight for time, so apologies if your question doesn't get read out. Finally, this is only our third time doing this. We're learning every week. I actually think it's gone quite well so far, but please do be patient if there are any technical glitches. Okay, great. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Hanna Wheatley, who is a senior researcher at NEF. Hanna, are you there?
I'm here, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you, but I'm trusting other people can. So Hanna, why has this crisis been so bad for renters and the homeless community? And what has the government done so far to respond? And what should they be doing next?
Great, thanks, Fergal. Yeah, really glad to have the chance to talk about this issue. When so much of the government's response to the crisis relies on people staying at home, housing's obviously become a really key focus of our response to coronavirus. And the virus itself is revealing the massive inequalities that already existed in the UK when it comes to housing. We're seeing a public health crisis layered on top of a housing crisis, and the weight of that is essentially exposing the cracks that were already there. Our research at NEF recently has outlined two groups that are particularly vulnerable when it comes to housing and coronavirus. As Fergal said, renters and homeless people. So with renters, private renting, as many of you will know, is the most expensive form of housing, and 35% of private renters are living in poverty. Our recent research, which is soon to be published, shows that more than 1.2 million renters are at high risk of losing their jobs or hours as a result of social distancing measures. That's a massive problem because there was also research at the end of last year that showed that nearly half of private renters would not be able to afford more than 1 month's rent if they lost their job. And we're already seeing this play out. So some research from the beginning of April found that as the crisis bites, residential tenants are already paying less than half of what they owe in rent. So as incomes dry up, families' means of paying their rent dries up too. And so far, the government's package of support doesn't meet the level of need for renters. So there are various income supports, as we talked about on the last call, and benefits options, but not all renters will benefit from them. And actually, even those who do will see their incomes fall significantly. Knowing that many renters will struggle to pay their rent, the government has also announced that it will suspend evictions. But given that a large proportion of renters are likely to accrue significant rent arrears if they lose their income during this period, even with the increased benefits, and a temporary suspension of evictions, and basically when the suspension of evictions is lifted, these tenants can then be evicted unless they can find the money to pay for that rent that they haven't paid during that time. Although we know that landlords have been advised to show compassion, it's a tricky one, but basically the government can't leave the fate of renters to the whims of individual landlords and whether or not they're willing to show compassion. So from our analysis, renters are being asked to shoulder the economic costs of the crisis, and the end result of that could be a massive increase in evictions and homelessness. And then for homelessness, despite the rhetoric that the coronavirus doesn't discriminate and we're all in it together, homeless people are particularly vulnerable to coronavirus because they're more at risk of the very health problems that make people vulnerable to coronavirus. And many, of course, lack access to amenities that many of us are taking advantage of to keep us safe. So far, the government's response to protecting homeless people has been to call on local authorities to get everybody in, prioritising rough sleepers. They've set aside £3.2 million, which is available to local authorities in England, and will reimburse them for the costs of providing accommodation. I've heard different numbers. Fergal, you mentioned the 13,500. I've also heard 4,000 potentially of households who have been placed in these emergency accommodations by their councils already. So that's very quick. You know, we've seen things moving at huge, very quick speed. But there are quite a few shortfalls, one being that it mainly focuses on rough sleepers when there are many more hidden homeless. But it's clearly also only a short-term solution. What happens when the hotel stays end, as Fergal said? So with renters and homeless people, the government's response so far has been necessary but not sufficient. And so we've been doing a bit of thinking about the policies that we might need in the next phases. So on rent, we're looking at a rent suspension, and so we're proposing the temporary blanket suspension of residential rents and a freeze of residential mortgages to ensure that no one loses their home. Research published earlier on this month found an overwhelming majority of the public are in favour of rent suspension during the pandemic, including 3 in 4 renters and even a slight majority of landlords. We're about to publish a briefing on this topic, so please keep an eye out for that on NEF's channels. On homelessness, we are of the opinion that many, I think, will share that no one should be forced back onto the streets when the hotel stays end. And the one that we're looking at in terms of this at the moment is rapidly increasing social housing, but without building, because obviously the construction industry has taken a big hit, is slowing down in a huge way, and we need to keep that going while we're under lockdown. Although I have seen that some are starting to go back to work. So essentially, how do we increase social housing without building? And that's about making better use of the housing stock we already have, which basically means the government needs to buy some housing. We're looking at a few different options to explore that, but one would be allowing local authorities and housing associations to buy unsold private market homes from developers and being funded to do that through the government, probably at discounted market rates, because we don't want the big developers to be profiting off the housing crisis that they themselves have contributed to by not building the social housing in the first place, but I digress. Other options are subsidising housing associations to turn their unsold housing, market housing, into social housing, so subsidising them to flip those homes. And then also looking at councils being bolstered with the funding to buy empty homes that are suitable for social housing. Obviously, these solutions aren't going to solve the housing crisis alone. And longer term, we need to create new targets for social house building coming out of a likely recession. That will create jobs, and it will also create the homes that people need. So we're seeing the government finally stumping up some of the cash and somehow suddenly talking about workers and renters and homeless people who successive governments haven't talked about so much in recent years. But we need to keep the pressure on to ensure that these short-term policies and emergency solutions turn into long-term change. So we're thinking about how rent suspension and homelessness solutions can make the space to talk about things like rent control and increasing social housing. The measures that the government takes now could shape the housing system that we have coming out of this crisis. So we're really keen to hear from all of you and from others who are working on this to think about how we can all work together to keep the government on the right track to shape the housing system that we have coming out of this, because we can't go back to the housing crisis we had before. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hannah. I think that was a really useful starting point to the discussion. And just to say, if anyone wanted to hear a little bit more about what Hannah was talking about, you can check out the podcast that we recorded, the weekly economics podcast that we recorded on housing and coronavirus just last week on our website. And you can also see the blogs that Hannah's written there as well. So we just posted the links to those in the chat. We had a question that was sent in to us by email, Han. I'm guessing that is following up on the kind of the stuff that you're talking about empty homes and construction work, which is basically, is it possible to continue construction work whilst maintaining social distancing guidelines? And maybe if you could talk a bit more about this empty homes idea that you had as a way of coming around that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, lots of construction is continuing, things that are seen as vital construction, and I think there are guidelines for how that can continue to happen in a way that meets social distancing guidelines, but obviously that's difficult. I think that empty homes is a really interesting one because lots of people have talked about them, using empty homes for social housing, but lots of them aren't in the right place or aren't quite the right size. And so ordinarily, under sort of normal times, I probably wouldn't be talking about them as one of the main solutions to the housing crisis. I would be talking about changing the land, the way that we value land, changing the way that developers can have massive profits and undercut local authorities' social house building targets. But now, in the situation that we're currently in, where construction is slowing down, suddenly empty homes do become a bigger part of the puzzle, at least in the medium term. And so I do think it's important for us to think about utilising the housing stock that we already have as best we can. I think construction is quite likely to be one of the first areas of work to start picking up again, because we have a real need for it. And as it's outside often, and there's protective equipment involved, I can imagine that it could be one where social distancing could be kept in place. So with that, I would want to see the government prioritising social housing, essentially. Now that they've brought all these people in off the streets, they had a target to end street homelessness in the next 5 years, and by some measures they've done that in a few weeks. Obviously there are still many hidden homeless people who aren't being housed yet. I've heard anecdotally that people have been told to sleep rough to get housed. There's lots of issues, but they've got that, and they've actually earmarked quite a lot of money for ending it in the next 5 years. So there is money that they've earmarked for homelessness, and I would like to see that money and increased money put towards building social housing, so that when construction does start to come back in a greater way, that can be prioritised, especially things like housing that is halfway complete at the moment. Prioritising finishing homes so that we can massively increase the social housing that we need.
Cool, that's fantastic. I've got one more follow-up question from Luke Newman in the chat. Luke says, "Hi Hannah, with supply a key issue on this matter, what importance does NEF place on incentivising / forcing developers to build out planning applications? I work for a local authority and we are approving many more applications than construction being completed."
Yeah, I mean, I think supply is a really interesting one. We've heard from the government over the last few years that part of the problem with the housing crisis is supply, and the reason that no one can afford to buy a house, and the reason that we have increasing rates of homelessness is because we don't have enough homes, and that is true, but we also don't have enough of the right kind of homes, and that's one of the most important things. So the argument that if we just increase supply, prices will drop doesn't quite work in the UK, and especially in areas of high demand, because we've got so much financialised demand that's speculative. So people who are buying housing as a way to store money, as a way to accrue value. So it's not sort of genuine need. which means that we can keep building and building and building, but unless we're building the kind of affordable housing that people really need, they're not, the affordability crisis won't be solved. So I think that we need to be having much stricter sort of guidelines on social housing in particular. The government has talked about affordable housing as a broad category, but many people who are working on homelessness and the housing crisis recognise that social housing is one category within that needs to be prioritised, because some affordable housing can be 80% of the market value, which is largely unaffordable for most people still. So yeah, having stronger social house building targets that we really see as an opportunity coming out of the recession, for the government to hugely invest in something that will create jobs in areas all over the country, because we need social housing everywhere, and will provide homes that we need.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah, and thanks for joining us. And thanks for everyone for asking lots of really good questions in the chat. We're going to try and make sure that we do record all of those questions as well, and find a way of answering them. So don't worry if your question doesn't get answered this evening. Okay, cool. I think we're going to move on to our second speaker, Diarmaid Ward, councillor for Holloway and executive member for housing and development in Islington Council. Diarmaid, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, great. Thanks again so much for standing in last minute and joining us. We really appreciate it. Could you talk about some of the measures that have been taken in Islington Council to protect renters and the homeless community? What obstacles you come up against and how did you overcome them?
Absolutely. Hello everyone, very, very happy to be here. Always happy to have a chat with the New Economics Foundation. I was told about this meeting about half an hour ago, so please forgive me if this is a little bit disjointed, but as was said, I'm the Islington's cabinet member for housing and development, and my passion is making sure that we can try and solve and tackle the absolutely desperate housing situation in our borough. I very much see the current crisis as an opportunity, and it's up to the government to, in terms of housing, it's up to the government to either use that opportunity or to waste it, I suppose. In terms of what's been done so far, I think the government's call on local authorities almost 3 weeks ago now to get everyone indoors and get everyone indoors that weekend. The sentiment is wonderful, but that was at best very ambitious and at worst grossly naive, really naive about the true nature of homelessness in London. And firstly, the existing homelessness in London, and secondly, the amount of street homelessness that this crisis has caused and continues to cause, and the number of people who find themselves, even working people who are in full-time jobs, who find themselves in very, very precarious housing situations. Our street count in November last year in Islington was over 50 people bedding down on the streets of Islington. We got that down to just over 20 in January of this year. But just to put that in context, since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, we've managed to get over 90 people into self-contained accommodation. So this crisis has caused homelessness, is continuing to cause homelessness. There are a wide variety of reasons for that. You'll have people who were living in very unstable accommodation, people working in the gig economy who were living in kind of backpacker hostel type accommodation, paying nightly or weekly. You'll have a lot of people who were sofa surfing, staying with one friend for a month, staying with another friend for another month. In the current lockdown, that's virtually impossible. And you've got people fleeing violent situations and domestic violence situations. So new street homelessness is still happening. Our outreach team are working very, very hard, but this is not something that we're going to solve today or tomorrow. And I think the government's attitude to it just portrayed a real naivety about the situation in London. We're very proud that we were one of the first boroughs to help set up a community task force, and we're very proud to work with our partners, Streets Kitchen, Museum of Homelessness, and the Outside Project on that community task force. That task force sprung into action very, very quickly. They're currently working out of a council community centre, and they're distributing food to all of the homeless people who have now been given self-contained accommodation, which is no mean feat. And we couldn't do that without just the thriving grassroots and community sector in our borough. They've been absolutely brilliant. So an awful lot of work's been done over the past few weeks in terms of homelessness. We've been working with private renters as well. I think on private renters, the most important thing is access to immediate advice about the rights in these situations, and particularly landlord. I mean, we've had quite a few cases where landlords have just said, "Yeah, you've got to go now," because you've got landlords kind of fearing the worst in the current situation, and we've been able to immediately get that advice to them, like, this crisis hasn't changed anything. Your landlord still has to go through all the legal channels, and we'll help you. And we've got a dedicated team who actually speaks to landlords and negotiates them, a kind of a prevention team to make sure that dodgy landlords aren't trying to pull a fast one on renters. But as I said at the beginning, I think this crisis should be an opportunity, and it should be an opportunity to address the really precarious housing situation we have in the UK. Even on the government's own figures, street homelessness spiralled in the last 10 years, really spiralled. And there's no doubt that is a result of 10 years of austerity. And it shows that austerity is a false economy. And if you downgrade public services like local authorities, like the NHS, like mental health services, like the police, you will end up with other issues. And often street homelessness is one of the things that kind of falls through the cracks. You'll get the government saying, well, the police still function, local authorities still function, the NHS still functions. They do, but the more they have to concentrate on their own core services, the more other things actually fall through the cracks, and street homelessness is very much part of that. In terms of where we go from here, very little has been said by the government about, okay, we've got people indoors. They like to talk about this figure of 90% of rush sleepers are now indoors. I would question that figure. And they like to tell local authorities that they've got to keep working to get everyone indoors. Nothing very much has been said about a long-term solution to this. And I would very much like to use the opportunity here to help shape that long-term solution. Housing first, in my view, is the way forward on this. It's an idea that came from Finland and from New York from New York to an extent. There's never been a national Housing First programme here. There's been lots of little local initiatives. In Islington, we've had our own pilot Housing First programme. We've used our own council homes to do that on a small scale. And the way it works is you actually give someone a tenancy straight out. You don't use tenancy as a reward. And with that tenancy, you give people wraparound support. And we were very proud to work with a single homeless project on our wraparound support. But Housing First needs resources for the wraparound support. And if you take Islington as an example, Islington has lost 70% of its core government grants in the last decade. Our neighbouring local authorities in inner London have faced similar cuts. So it takes resources, but it also takes homes, and homes are something that we have fewer and fewer of. Hannah's absolutely right. It's not just about supply. If it was just an issue of pure supply, Islington would have solved its housing crisis many, many years ago. It's about the right kind of homes. Housing in London is very much a global reserve currency. You could, decide to speculate on the stock market. You could buy bonds. The safest thing you can put your money into is London property, and that's very much happening. That's what puts the price up. Is this using of London property as a global reserve currency? So we need to make sure that we build the right kinds of homes, and the most important kind of home we need to build are social homes, council homes. Councils have a part to play in that. It's very, very difficult to build council homes at the moment. The government grant to build a council home only covers a third of the build costs, so local authorities have to find the other 2/3. That's fine in London up to a point, because you can build a cross-subsidise. You can build some private homes to cross-subsidise a lot of council homes. That's simply not possible in other parts of the country. And as well as that, not only have you got right to buy decimating council stock, but local authorities don't get the money back from a right to buy. 25% of it goes to the Treasury, and of the rest, they're only allowed to apply 1/3 of a right to buy receipt towards a new council home. So the first thing to do is we've got to actually properly equip councils to build council homes, and we've got to actually we've got to change how we do planning. In Islington, we've got some of the toughest planning rules in the country. In any site in the borough, any private developer who's building, if it's a site of more than 10 homes, they need to build 50% genuinely affordable homes. We're very clear on what we mean by that. We mean at least 35% social homes for social rent, and then we leave the other 15% for some kind of intermediate product, London living, rent, shared ownership, something for someone who can't get on a council housing list but still can't afford to rent or to buy in the borough. So we need to build council homes, but we also need to actually change the planning system in order to make sure private developers play their part as well. We've had a recent High Court victory in Islington that you might have heard about, the Parkhurst Road case, where a developer paid way over the odds for a site, paid 13 million for a site. To put it in context, our council new build team put in a bit of 6 million at the time, because that's what it was worth. Then came to our planning committee and said, yeah, we can't afford to build out any social homes because we paid too much for the site. To which our planning committee said, yeah, go and do one. That case went all the way to the High Court, and the High Court judge agreed with us and said, if you are going to build homes in central London and pay lots and lots of money for a site, pay millions for a site, then check out what the local planning regulations are. So I'm very, very pleased to say that that site's not been built out by another company who have promised 50% genuinely affordable homes. So that's kind of in the long term. Firstly, we need to build council homes. We need to ensure developers are building their fair share of social homes, and we need a housing first programme in the short to medium term to make sure that we don't waste this opportunity. We've managed to get so many people who were street homeless indoors. Let's not waste this opportunity. Let's use that opportunity to actually end street homelessness. We've shown that it can be done. It needs resources, but first and foremost, it needs political will. And whilst it's very clear that the current government have political will in terms of the current crisis, they have yet to show they have actually any political will to end this in the long term. There was a very noble ambition in the Conservative manifesto of the last election to end rough sleeping in one parliamentary term. By my reckoning, that gives them about 1,000 days if they're going to fulfil that manifesto pledge. But the pledge didn't mention, what the pledge didn't mention was the most important thing. It didn't mention homes. Where are we actually going to get the homes to end rough sleeping? Let's empower councils to build council homes. Let's ensure that developers build their share of council homes. And let's actually make this a political priority. Hannah's absolutely right. In the short term, the quickest way to do this is to actually buy homes. There is massive precedent for that. In the late 70s, early 80s, Islington Council bought entire streets because it was a very different borough in those days, and it wasn't the high-priced borough it was now. It was very much seen as kind of inner city, and that's why you have got in Islington, you've got council homes, council flats sitting side by side with 2 million, £3 million properties, because a lot of street properties were bought up by the council in the late 70s, early 80s. So there is definitely a precedent for the state buying of homes in a crisis situation. I'm sure I've gone over my time. Sorry if that was a bit kind of all over the place. I hope that made some sense. But yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, David. I thought that was fantastic. At short notice, you really couldn't tell that you'd just been told about the meeting about an hour ago. So thank you so much for coming and speaking. And it's definitely really inspiring to hear about all the amazing work that's been happening in Islington. I think we all feel that like local authorities should be an important part of dealing with this crisis. So like, yeah, anyone on this call, like if you live in the UK, like we really want you to be able to sort of take the things that you've learned on this call and go and speak to your local councillors about what actions they're taking to protect renters and the homeless community during this crisis. We're a little bit over time, so what I think I'll do just to make sure that we do have time for all the speakers is move on to our next speaker now, and then maybe we can come back to some of the questions potentially at the end if we've got time. But thank you so much again, Diarmaid, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Okay, great. Just before I move on to our third speaker, I just want to do a very quick shout out, as we always do, to all the NEF supporters on the call. Your generosity is really helping us fund our responses to the crisis so far, including supporting us to do these briefings. So thank you very, very much. If you're not a NEF supporter and you'd like to become one, then please check out our shiny new supporters network page on the website. We're posting a link in the chat now. Great. So let's move on to our third speaker, Anny Cullum, who is a national organiser with Acorn. Anny, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Amazing. Hi, Anny. Welcome to the call. Thanks for joining us. Could you talk us through a little bit about what the experience of tenants has been over the past few weeks and what the tenants movement is doing to respond to the coronavirus crisis?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for having me on. So Acorn is a community and tenants union, but we're also working with other groups of organised tenants such as Live in Rent and London Renters Union to work towards putting pressure on the government to make sure that renters are properly protected during this time. I think what Hannah said was really important, that the experiences renters are going through in this crisis, they aren't new. The crisis is just exacerbating problems that already existed. So we've seen renters being served eviction notices. We've seen renters struggling to pay rent. You've got to remember that a lot of the industries that have been hit hard, such as the service industry and hospitality industry, a lot of those people rent, they've lost their jobs and don't have any income coming in. So they're not able to pay their rent and are worried about eviction. We've also seen repairs not being done and landlords using the crisis as a kind of excuse not to get some very essential health and safety things done. And also people are really, really worried about long-term debt. Even if they do get a suspension now, or their landlord says they don't have to pay, they're worried about having to pay that money back in the long term and how that will affect them. And what Hannah said about what the government has done so far and why it's inadequate is really true, because they have temporarily banned evictions and made eviction notices longer, but this is just kicking the can down the road. And it will mean that people are in lots of debt that will take a lot of time to work off, and renters shouldn't be paying for this crisis. It's unfair that like the private landlord sector should be the only area that isn't kind of financially affected by this. Another big hole in what the government have offered is they've not extended protection for eviction to lodgers. We've got a member in Bristol who is a frontline NHS worker who is under threat of eviction from her landlady because she's worried about contracting coronavirus, and those protections that they've brought in has not extended to her. And as Hannah said, we can't just rely on people's compassion. No one's right to housing and safety, particularly in a crisis of this scale, should rely on the goodwill of others. And that's why we're calling for proper legislation to protect the renters in this country. So the demands that our organisation have come up with, and again, we're in conversation with others, is a rent waiver. So no one to be in debt because they won't be able to pay the rent because of a result of the crisis. And what we're asking the government to do is to amend the Housing Act. So the coronavirus emergency bill that brought in the changes to evictions amended existing housing acts by changing clauses in them. We're asking them to change the Section 8 clause, which is the clause that landlords can use to evict people who are in rent arrears. We want them to change that to say that any arrears accrued in this crisis cannot be used as grounds for eviction. So that way, legislating for a total rent suspension. What we're also calling for is the government to end unfair Section 21 evictions. So these are no-fault evictions. Theresa May's government did commit to doing this, but they haven't done it yet. And we think that this is the opportune time for them to bring this in to stop homelessness from rising as a result of the crisis. We're also asking that they extend protections to lodgers. And as Hannah said, looking at doing proper legislated mortgage freezes as well, so we don't see lower income or normal income homeowners becoming homeless because of this. So those are the main things we're looking at. No rent debt, ending unfair evictions, extending protections to lodgers, and better protection for mortgage holders as well. We think that the way that they've gone around this has been quite strange. So they've offered lots of welfare options to renters, but that's putting the onus on up to 20 million renters to claim benefits. And we think it would make much more sense to enact a rent suspension and make benefits for landlords who are potentially struggling, who it's their only house and their only income, make benefits for them available. There's only 2 million landlords in the country and 20 million tenants, so it makes a lot more sense to legislate for the rent waiver and make financial support available to landlords instead if they really need it. So big campaign, and this is kind of some of the tactics that we're thinking of how we're planning to win. So we've launched a big petition, which is gaining traction. We're talking to other groups of organised renters and looking at digital campaigning tactics that we can use in the lockdown social distancing scenario that can bring this issue to the fore. So things such as coordinated weekly Twitter storms of Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, and other high players in government to keep this issue high up on the agenda. We're also keeping a key eye on key figures in the government's media diaries to be able to exploit phone-ins, for example, to give renters the opportunity to voice their concerns and why they feel that these measures need to be taken. We're enlisting allies to make us help us to make for public health case for this. We all know that poverty has a big impact on outcomes in lots of different health scenarios, and having access to a safe and stable home will surely make sure that fewer people are taken by coronavirus. One of the things that's upcoming, which everyone on this call could do, is there's going to be a parliamentary select committee looking at homelessness, coronavirus and private renting, when they're asking people to submit evidence of what their experience is and what they think needs to be done going forward. So we're going to be mobilising our members and supporters to do that, and you can do that online on the government's website. We're also providing support to renters on a local level to negotiate rent reductions and rent write-offs with their landlords. That's gone really well in some cases, with some landlords completely writing off rent or giving blanket reductions, to completely the other way and then them not caring about people losing their jobs and having to choose between rent and eating. So there's been it shows why we can't just rely on compassion in these situations. Another thing that we're doing is we're doing mass training across the country on Zoom. We're planning these to train people up on how to resist evictions. We want to build up a skilled base of renters and community members across the country that are ready to stop evictions happening once the ban is lifted. This is a strategic thing to show that if the government don't concede to our demands and properly protect renters, there will be hell to pay if the demands aren't met or people are being chased for rent debt. And another thing that we've thought of is one of the most amazing things recently has been seeing people developing community mutual aid networks, and we're sure that lots of those people would want to get involved in protecting people who are vulnerable to homelessness and vulnerable to eviction. So we're looking to organise within those spaces as well to recruit more people to get on board with this campaign and step up to protect community members from homelessness. And finally, in some areas we're looking at doing localised rent strikes as well. So those are kind of the plans that we've got to win, and again we're in conversation working out how we can all cooperate on a national level to make this happen. But kind of my key calls to action would be, for now, so please sign the petition and have a look at the COVID-19 private renting and homelessness parliamentary select committee meeting, because you can submit your evidence by May the 1st to help sway which action the government takes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was fantastic. And I think we already posted this in the chat, but like Annie says, please do check out Acorn's petition for the government to provide adequate protection for renters now. You can sign that. Just shared it again in the chat I've just sent. And also, yeah, if you're a renter and you haven't already, then join a union. If you're based in London, check out London Renters Union, check out Acorn for the rest of the country, and Living Rent, who do amazing work in Scotland. And yeah, like big up to all those people and also, to all those groups, and to you, Annie, for all the organising you're doing at the moment. Thank you. There's more info for all of those groups, by the way, in the chat. So I just wanted to ask a follow-up question that was sent in by email about rent strikes. I know you sort of mentioned it a little bit at the end, but maybe I don't know if you could talk through a little bit about what it means to like have a rent strike and some of the sort of like positive and negative aspects of it, because I know it's kind of a mixed bag, isn't it?
Yeah, so rent strikes are a fantastic tactic to use against individual landlords, and they're particularly powerful when you've got lots of tenants that have all got the same landlord. So this is why you see them springing up in universities or potentially in housing associations that aren't treating people properly. However, in order for a rent strike to be successful, you need to make sure that you've got a big proportion of people willing to go on rent strike. Because nothing can kind of kill a campaign quicker than a failed attempt at a rent strike. We know that organising rent strikes on a national scale definitely has to be on the table, but it's not something that the movement is going to jump into without serious confidence that enough people are willing to do it. We've been looking at it at different local levels, and there's lots of complicating factors. For example, I myself might be willing to go on rent strike, but I'm in a joint tenancy. If my housemates aren't, then they'll be liable for the whole rent of the house, and then also things could fall on guarantors. So it's quite a complicated bag to organise on a national scale, but on local scales it can be extremely powerful, and one of the most powerful tools that renters have got. So we've got a really good example at the moment of students who are part of Lancaster Acorn, who are going on strike at the moment against their university, who are still making them pay for halls that they're not using. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us on the call this evening, Annie. We really appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, I think we've heard that unfortunately John Glacken, who was going to call in next, is having some technical difficulties or some issues getting on the call. So what I think we might do, because we've got a bit of time left, is do something which is way more technically ambitious than anything we've ever done on one of these calls before, and go back to a previous speaker. So if we could still speak to Diarmaid, is Diarmaid still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Amazing, cool. We had loads of questions in the chat for you, Diarmaid.
Sure.
So maybe if we could just shoot you one of them, and then maybe like if you could keep your answer fairly brief, because we might want to go to Hanna as well for like another question. That's possible. Okay, so we had a question about so is this situation of finding accommodation for all those who are homeless sustainable? What does this mean for the long term? And are measures and approaches different from local authority to local authority? So I guess there's a few questions there. There's one about sort of entrenching some of the changes that have been made around like housing rough sleepers. And then there's one about sort of different approaches that have been taken by different local authorities.
Yeah, the current approach is sustainable only in the short term without a massive increase in resources. The example I'll always give is the Homelessness Reduction Act, which came in a few years ago. It had cross-party support because on paper it was a great piece of legislation requiring local authorities to give much more support to single homeless people. The problem was it simply wasn't properly resourced, and there's no point kind of bringing in lots of extra regulations if you don't have the homes to back it up. So in the short term, we can deal with it. And Islington's approach has very much been, we will house anyone, no questions asked. And that's pretty much what the government guidance says on this, particularly around rough sleepers who are no recourse to public funds. All local authorities should be following the government guidance and just housing everybody. This is a public health emergency. I think our neighbouring boroughs in London are certainly following that protocol. I don't know about local authorities around the country, but the short answer is no, this is not sustainable. for more than a few weeks unless there are a lot more resources put into the sector.
Okay, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. There was, did we have any other questions? I will just check. I had a question about private renters. So private renters are at increased risk of illegal eviction. This person says, what do councils need to make prevention and redress effective? I guess that means preventing people being illegally evicted.
I think you kind of need to go, I mean, if in the short term, what local authorities need is more resource so that we can put more resource into helping private renters. But what we need in the long term is we need to really tear up the current landlord-tenant relationship we have in this country. We now have a situation where an entire generation has no option but to be long-term private renters, and we're in a country with the weakest protections for private renters in Europe. So in the long term, we need to change that relationship. It's different all across Europe. You know, in Italy, you get a 4-year tenancy. You have the option to sign on for another 4 years. Similar situations in German cities. We don't have any of that here.
Thank you so much, Diarmaid. That was really concise. In fact, it was so concise it didn't give me time to find a question for Hannah, which I'm still looking for. But thank you so much for joining us again this evening. We really appreciate it. I think probably we are running out of time now, so I think maybe we'll wrap up quite soon. Just to say thank you so much to all of the speakers who have joined us on the call this evening, and to all of you who have come and zoomed in again on a Thursday night. Just a reminder that you can sign up for next week's Zoom call already, which will be on childcare under lockdown. That will be with Christine Berry, as well as NEF's own Lucy Stevens. Have a look in the chat for a link. But thanks again, everyone. And remember to clap for the NHS and all of our carers at 8 p.m. See you next week. Bye-bye.